Okay, so this is where we left off last video. So this was found in Altamara, Spain in 1879 by an amateur archaeologist. And at first they thought that this was a forgery. The community in Spain thought it was a forgery, but eventually they became convinced that these were authentic. And these are 13 to 14,000 year old paintings of bison. And they are once again painted in profile. Some standing, some are curled up. Like as you can see, this one here appears to be curled up, kind of in a ball-like posture. So we don't know if they're dead or if they're giving birth. And they're pictured from above, like we're hovering above them instead of, like we were standing next to them. It's more like we're hovering above them. And none of the bison stand on a common ground line. So a ground line is a painted or carved baseline on which all figures appear to be standing. And there's no ground line in this piece. And then they seem to float above the viewers' heads. So obviously there's no background, which does not give us any indication of space or place. So because of these characteristics, a lot of scholars believe that these were painted at different times, perhaps spanning generations, as potentially part of a ritual of some sort. So this is called Spotted Horses and Negative Handprints, wall painting in the cave of Pecmerle, France, made in 23,000 BCE, 11 feet 2 inches long. So basically a series of spotted horses and negative hand imprints, and there are checks, dots all around the horses. Some people speculate this might be some of the first forms of writing, although that's just speculation. But it does seem odd that these marks are present. And also the negative handprints as well. In order to make these, the painter would have filled his mouth with some sort of pigment and then used a reed to blow out the pigment over the top of his hand. And then he would remove his hand, or she would remove her hand. And it almost seems like a signature in a way. And some of the hands have incomplete fingers, so maybe some of the fingers were held down, which could signify hand signals, which were commonly used by hunters probably during this time. So there might be some tie to hand signals with hunting as well, although I don't believe that they hunted and ate horses very often. So we're going to skip ahead to the woolly rhinoceros wounded by man, and then disemboweled bison. It's a painting in the cave at Lascaux, which we already kind of looked at. It's 1600 to 1400 BCE is the date on it. So we already covered the Hall of Bulls from the same cave in France, but this is a very significant painting because it shows a human figure, and it's a human man instead of a woman, because you can clearly see that it's a man. And to the left of it is now the extinct woolly rhinoceros, and it does appear that the rhinoceros is here, and then this is the bison, and the bison's guts are hanging out, so it's definitely wounded. And then there's also a bird-topped atlatl or spear here, that's what they think it is. And the man kind of has a bird-like face, like almost like a little beak. They're not sure if he's wounded or dead. So another notable thing about this particular painting is it appears to actually tell a story. Perhaps a man injured during a hunt, and he also injured the bison in return, which is actually a narrative, this is an example of the first narrative basically ever found in art. It's telling a visual story. So, this man went hunting and he got injured and he injured the bison. So it's a really significant piece because of that, because it's the first example that we've been able to find of a narrative in art. So this is also a pretty interesting piece from a cave, Vallon Pointe d'Arc, France. It's from 3400 to 3200 BCE, so a little bit older than the last example we looked at. Actually, quite a bit older than the last example we looked at. And this is a hugely important painting, and it helps us understand the stylistic advances that were made by Paleolithic painters. You know, they radiocarbon dated the pigment on the walls, the carbon charcoal, and they found out that it was much older than what they had thought. And it really forced scholars to reevaluate the scheme of stylistic development. You know, previously scholars had believed that style during the Paleolithic had really evolved from really primitive, simple paintings to more complex paintings. But this cave here, shows animals in very realistic terms. The animals are shown in front of one another. They're shown in strict profile. Even the bull's horns are in strict profile. So a very sophisticated drawing, very elegant drawing. The rhinos in the lower right here, they seem to be attacking each other and fighting. So that's actually a narrative. So that is actually one of, potentially the first narrative, before the last example we looked at. So it's very much, twice the age of most of the paintings we've looked at. And it kind of does away with that assumption that art evolved from simple to more complex representations, because this is such an old cave and the paintings in them are very complex. So, I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense because some artists are just more innovative than others. And obviously the artist that painted the animals in the Chauvet cave in France was obviously extremely talented and innovative. So we're going to kind of talk about Neolithic art. So imagine a time after the Paleolithic, the sheets of ice, start to go away, they melt, the climate warms, the sea levels start rising, and a separation of land masses occurs because of the rising sea levels. So England is separated from continental Europe and Spain from Africa. So we're entering the Neolithic period, or the New Stone Age. And humans are domesticating plants and animals, and they're no longer totally dependent on hunting as they were before during the Paleolithic. So the Neolithic is really a time of change. And this occurred in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, which is Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran area, that map that I showed you earlier. And it had the most fertile land and a really good supply of rain, and that's kind of why it started there. And also they were in the fertile river valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates River. So weaving, metalworking, pottery, counting are just some of the technologies that are being used during this time. So we're going to move on to the aerial view of the Neolithic site of Jericho. It was built around 8,000 to 7,000 BCE. And it's a fortified town. And it's located in the Jordan River Valley. And it had a lot of mud brick houses in it. And as Jericho became wealthier and wealthier, it needed a lot of protection. So, they had to create this huge rock cut ditch. So they actually carved down into the bedrock and created a ditch around the whole town, which helps them to fortify and protect the town from raiding peoples. And then they had a wall that was close to 13 feet high. And then there was a 30-foot tower with an inner stairway also that kind of helped protect the town of Jericho. And there was a lot of technological achievement, obviously, with, cutting into the bedrock and creating that tower and the wall and everything. So here's a piece found in Jericho. It's a human skull with restored features. It's from 7200 to 67 BCE. So it's modeled in plaster, painted, and it's inlaid with shells. So the eyes are shell. And I do believe it's over the top of a real human skull. And during this time that this was made, Jericho practiced the act of burying their dead under the floors of their houses. And they detached the craniums from the skeleton and then kind of reconstructed the facial features in plaster. And like I said, they put seashells for the eyes, they painted on the hair, and they were thought to have a realistic purpose, these skulls, And it's apparent during the Neolithic that peoples are very preoccupied with honoring the dead, which is kind of a new thing that ends up happening in the Neolithic. And that's how the Neolithic is a little different than the Paleolithic, is that there's more ancestor honoring, almost worship during the Neolithic. Another notable Neolithic settlement is Çatalhöyük in Turkey from 6000 BCE. So here's kind of a restored version of it. The population of this city was a herding society, but hunting still played an important role in the economy. They still were hunting. And you can see that it was important, hunting was important, because it is, hunting scenes are recorded on the wall paintings of some of the sites, some of the older rooms in the site. So the Neolithic wall paintings are very different than Paleolithic wall paintings in many ways. So in Neolithic art, one thing that's different is that the appearance of the human figure becomes more common, and also in groups. The human figure in groups shows up during the Neolithic. So we're going to talk about this piece here. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. It's called Deer Hunt, Detail of a Wall Painting from Level 3 at Çatalhöyük in Turkey. It's from 6000 BCE. And this shows an organized hunting party with bows and arrows. The heads are in profile view, which seems to be the most clear way to show the human head, but the torso is in frontal view. Again, one of the more informative viewpoints of the human body. And so this view is called this type of figure is called a composite figure, a composite view of the human figure, because it's showing a composite of views. I mean, profile mixed with frontal views are called, any kind of mixture of views of the human body or figure of any kind is called a composite view. And this is more of a conceptual representation as opposed to an optical representation. So an optical representation is more realistic. Conceptual representations are just more concerned with showing the most recognizable aspects of the figure and showing the figure in the simplest way possible. And this is a little bit different than a Paleolithic painting because it's actually done on a plaster, so the wall is prepared first with plaster and then allowed to dry. So they actually created a surface instead of just painting it directly on rock like they would have during the Paleolithic. In the Neolithic, they're actually preparing the surface first with plaster, and then they're using brushes instead of just reeds to apply the pigment to the cave wall. So let's talk about Europe. There's not very much evidence of Neolithic towns, but there's a lot of examples of monuments. And they use a lot of really large, rough-cut stones, and some weigh as much as 50,000 tons, which makes it a hugely impressive feat that Neolithic peoples were even able to move them. And historians call these large rocks megaliths. So Neolithic architecture that uses these large stones is called megalithic. So this is a megalithic structure here shown, the main chamber of a passage grave in Newgrange, England, dated to 3200 to 2500 BCE. And this is definitely an example of megalithic architecture. It's one of the oldest. It's located in Dublin, or north of Dublin in Ireland. And it's a passage grave, or it's a funerary monument. And it's a tomb with a long stone corridor leading to a burial chamber beneath a great tumulus or earthen mound. So as you can see, there's kind of a passage here, and then it leads to this chamber in here that's underneath a primitive dome. And it's actually called corbelled vaulting. So corbelled vaulting is constructed by piling stone blocks in horizontal courses and then slowly moving them inward until they create a dome. And the stones are held in place by their own weight. They're not using any mortar here. And the special feature of this tomb is that the winter solstice sun illuminates the passageway and makes its way into the burial chamber. As you can see in this picture, the sun is coming through the passageway during the winter solstice. And that's about it for this video.